The Soviet Union. After their victory in the Russian Civil War over the Whites, Lenin reigned for a grand total of 2 years. This then led to Stalin and the terror he caused. This was done through many famines, killing some of the most productive farmers and people in order to cement his communist regime. This accumulated in Stalin's purges, where nearly 1 million people would be imprisoned or die over the course of these purges, along with the many millions who had already been killed over the course of the other famines. This was then followed by World War II, where the Soviets faced immense casualties at the hands of the Nazis. However, due to the victory at the battles of Kursk, Stalingrad, Leningrad and Moscow, the Soviets managed to hold back the Germans and defeat them in war. Then after World War II, Stalin died in 1953, where he was then succeeded by Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev lasted until 1964, where Brezhnev replaced him, and he lasted until 1982. In his last years, starting the Soviet-Afghan War, in 1989, the Soviets left with many casualties, and this led to political instability along with the Chernobyl disaster of 1986. Both of these things led to the instability that caused the collapse of the Soviet Union. But you may be wondering, why am I talking about the history of the Soviet Union when this is a video about the music of the Soviet Union? Well, the music and history are very aligned. And whatever period of history the Soviet Union was going through was also very heavily correlated with the music. So let's get into early Soviet music. From 1922, the Soviet Union was in full control of Russia and its people, and with this, the evolution of its music. With its isolation, the main influences were the Soviet composers that lay within their territory. Some songs include adaptations of the song Kaytusha, and Kalinka. Written in the times of the Tsardom of Russia. This music evolved in the 30s with the evolution of Soviet film, mainly for propaganda purposes, with songs like Tachanka, heavily promoting patriotism within the Soviet Union. And as soon as the Soviet Union fell into its first major war against the Nazi regime, many songs began to proliferate among Soviet soldiers. The wartime songs were heavily popular as a way to promote nationalism in the regime and to bear with the suffering the Nazis brought upon them. One of these songs is called Dark is the Night.
Только ветер гудит в проводах, тускло звезды мерцают.
Personally, I like this song because although I'm not a native Russian speaker or a speaker of any of the Slavic languages, the music still seems to transcend language and convey the emotions of the suffering of the war. Another song from the war era is Sacred War. Both songs mentioned being composed for their propaganda value. Overall, these songs, like many others like the March of the Defenders of Moscow, and the Anthem of the Soviet Union, represent a regime fighting an enemy for their survival, and the vigour and power of these songs exemplify power and vigour that Soviet soldiers need to carry out against the invader of the Germans. These songs still being heavily mentioned in today's meme culture in things like the communist meme. So the main songs I personally like from the era are these: Sacred War, March of the Defenders of Moscow, and Anthem of the Soviet Union.
Красная, красная кровь.
The Soviet Union post-war became a slightly different state, with the same oppression that continued under Stalin, but under slightly better economic prospects that allowed for more music to prosper. Many different genres began to build up, from Soviet jazz to bard. Much of this music was still heavily censored like jazz, where it was called bourgeoisie music and politically hated. However, it did eventually make a slight comeback with the overthrowing of Khrushchev. Soviet Estrada also dominated the early post-war period. Some composers of this period included Mark Bernes and Sergei Kakava. Then later on, between the 60s and 80s, the rider Volkalna, a stage-sponsored music towards the youth that implemented many elements of folk, rock, disco and new wave, getting across the state message of communism. Now on to why I like Soviet music. Like I previously mentioned, I don't like the regime of the Soviet Union at all. An oppressive regime that suppressed most free thought in order to implement their socialist paradise that ended up being less effective state capitalism without the freedom. However, the music of the late Soviet Union really does sound good, and this could be partially because the repression of the people for all this time was suddenly released with one singular Soviet premiere. Also, the people of the Soviet Union are very talented. Like the Soviets were the first to go into space, so of course they have talent. So it was and still a real shame that the people of the Soviet Union and of the past and the people of Russia today face such repression. That more serious note, here are some of my favourite songs of the era.
Только ветер гудит в проводах, тускло звезды мерцают.
Растрескавшейся земле, одеялом лоскутным на ней. Пожелай мне не остаться в этой траве, не остаться